Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased today to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. David Levy Lewis, and to welcome him back to Columbia. He was with us in October 2016 as we marked the 7th anniversary of the meeting of the Southern Negro Youth Congress in Columbia in October of 1946. Professor Lewis was born in Little Rock, Arkansas. As a child and a young adult, it was not uncommon for the Lewis family to entertain and host the who's who of Negro America. Professor Lewis recalls dinner guests that included Congressman Adam Clayton Powell Jr., concert singer Marian Anderson, NAACP leader Walter White and Channing Tobias, Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, and W.E.B. Du Bois. After attending the Booker T. Washington High School in Columbia in Atlanta, at the age of 15, he enrolled at Fisk University in Nashville. While there, he earned distinction as the co-chair of the debating team at Fisk. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa 2 years after the Brown v. Board decision. He then attended the University of Michigan Law School. And about his short stint in law school, Professor Kennedy, he says the following: "There was law school briefly at the University of Michigan. I was unhappy with the law. I did well academically, but I decided that I didn't want a career as a lawyer. Over my parents' vociferous objections, I left law school. I took a bus to New York, and I talked my way into graduate school at Columbia." He talked his way into graduate school at Columbia. He eventually earned an MA degree in history from Columbia. And while at Columbia, there was an interesting experience where he said he went off to Harlem one evening, and he spent the evening with Sweet Daddy Grace of the House of Prayer debating the existence of God. Professor Lewis should write more about that encounter with Sweet Daddy Grace. He then earned a PhD degree in modern European and French history from the London School of Economics and Political Science in 1962. His teaching career has taken him to the University of Ghana, Howard University, Morgan State, University of the District of Columbia, Cornell, Notre Dame, Harvard, UC San Diego, Rutgers, and most recently, he was the Julius Silver University professor at New York University. His writings are extensive, including the very first academic biography of Martin Luther King Jr. Some years ago, when I served on the staff of the Martin Luther King Jr. Papers Project, I came across an interesting FBI file about King, a biography published in 1970. It seems that the FBI was quite concerned about the findings of Professor Lewis. And so was J. Edgar Hoover, who refused to grant him an interview. But this following statement was in the file. Quote, "There is nothing derogatory in Bureau files which can be identified with David Lewis." In 1974, he publishes The Prison of Honor, The Dreyfus Affair, followed by the book When Harlem Was in Vogue, and then the two-part series about W.E.B. Du Bois, which won the Pulitzer Prize. He also won the Bancroft Prize and the Francis Parkman Prize as well. It is fitting today that we honor and recognize the 150th anniversary of the 14th Amendment and the birth of Du Bois by having Dr. Lewis with us. When the second volume of the Du Bois biography was released, John Hope Franklin said the following: "I did not think it was possible for David Lewis to surpass what he had accomplished with the first volume of the Du Bois biography, but he has. In his second volume, he confirms the view of many of us who believe that he is the finest American historian plying his craft today." Today, we're very fortunate to have the preeminent American historian with us. Please join me in welcoming Dr. David Levy Lewis.
I am really regretful that I have to inflict myself upon you as you enjoy a splendid lunch, but I am pleased to be here, and doubly pleased to be reminded of a few things that I did that I would perhaps revisit and do differently after that very full introduction and profile of my early years. It is good to be back. I think I should be candid and say that I had the impression that there would be more historians and fewer lawyers at the symposium. Somehow, I thought that the Reconstruction Congress Symposium of last term was in fact the event today. And so, I don't have much to say about the 14th Amendment. Although, of course, the 14th Amendment and Du Bois are coterminous. This is the sesquicentenary of both events. The 14th Amendment, we learned so splendidly yesterday, has enhanced and enabled a race to achieve its rights. The 14th Amendment has also, of course, most recently, enabled corporations to impersonate people and achieve their rights as well. And both those things are, I think, symbolized in the critiques of W.E.B. Du Bois, who has much to say about everything over the course of the 20th century. And so bear with me if some of this is well known, others of it will be unknown, and some of it should not be known. The souls of black folk struck like a thunderclap. Thank you. Nothing like it had ever before been written by a person of color in America. Within weeks of its publication, the Chicago firm of A.C. McClurg and Company in April 1903, William James sent a copy of the book to his brother Henry in England, along with the ironic and off-cited observation that the only Southern book of any distinction published in many a year was written by a mulatto ex-student of mine. Somehow, even William James thought that Du Bois was a Southerner. Of course, he was from Great Barrington, Massachusetts, but there we go. From Heidelberg, Max Weber, another famous professor whose influence the young author had cited as having been significant, wrote of plans for a German translation and of his willingness to do the introduction to this splendid book. Die Seelen der Schwarzen would finally appear a century later. James Weldon Johnson, lyricist, novelist, diplomat, and civil rights paladin, authoritatively opined that the impact of the souls of black folk was greater upon and within the Negro race than any other single book published in this country since Uncle Tom's Cabin. Johnson's opinion was sound as far as it went, although it could have claimed all that and more for the book's great significance. 115 years after publication, there is in the entire body of social criticism still no more than a handful of meditations on the promise and failings of democracy in America to rival William Edward Burghardt Du Bois's extraordinary collection of 14 essays. Among the discerning commentaries on the American social contract, of which those of Alexis de Tocqueville, Gunnar Myrdal, Richard Hofstadter, Michael Harrington, and Oliver Cox are staples, Du Bois's Souls has pride of place for moral rigor and intellectual prescience. It transformed the history of thrice 100 years of black and white interaction on the North American continent with a suddenness so unprecedented as to divide the discourse on race into the time before and the time after the book's appearance. The 35-year-old author was the first to grasp the international implications of the struggle for racial justice, memorably proclaiming, as we know, at the dawn of this century that the problem of the 20th century would be the problem of the color line. He was a principal founder of the nation's oldest civil rights association, created 109 years ago last February, and whose militant monthly, The Crisis magazine, he edited as the voice of uncompromising racial equality for a quarter century. No exaggeration to state that a majority of literate African American households were weaned on Du Bois's monthly, even those beholden to the legacy of Booker T. Washington. All Americans owe Du Bois a considerable debt for the intellectual masterpiece, Black Reconstruction in America, which changed forever our understanding of the shameful suppression of racial democracy in the post-Civil War South, the very raison d'etre of this meaningful symposium. 40 years after the appearance of his remarkable Civil Rights Manifesto, William Edward Burghardt Du Bois had achieved an eminence and authority possessed by no other African American public figure. In mainstream America, his standing was validated by precedent-setting memberships in learning societies, receipt of prestigious foundation grants, essays and opinion pieces in leading newspapers, and attentive reviews of his books. No little wonder, then, that John Gunter's Inside USA would accord Du Bois a position almost like that of Shaw or Einstein in his field. A judgment affirmed by Henry Steele Commodore's 1948 list, Men Who Make Up Our Minds. 3 years after Commodore's assessment, however, Du Bois's reputation would lie in ruins, his freedom to walk and work among his compatriots hanging in the balance of Cold War justice. But we are too far ahead of our story. We must fast backward to the years before the fall from grace, back to the time when his death would have been widely regretted, instead of that later time when his death, as he liked to say, would be practically requested. Having entered the public world of ideas and action in April 1903 as a cultural elitist and philosophical idealist with the publication of Souls, Du Bois's penultimate act of conscience in October 1961 was as one of the last Americans formally to join the Communist Party of the United States. To explain why and how this political migration from Edwardian correctness to revolutionary socialism occurred is to unravel much of the conundrum of race in America. For it was not at all apparent in the beginning how far Du Bois would travel down a road of dissent and admonition, leading ultimately to an economic and political apostasy that ultimately caused him to be purged for a time from the memory of most of his countrymen and women. For much longer than this biographer would have wished, Du Bois condescended to the very folk whose aspirations and welfare he would come to articulate and to explain with unsurpassed integrity. When the so-called Lodge Force Bill to enforce black voting rights in the South failed of passage in the Senate in 1890, Harvard graduate student Du Bois had sniffed in the African-American newspaper New York Age, "When you have the right sort of black voters, you will need no election laws." One even finds a jarringly patronizing passage or two in the Souls of Black Folk, as in that otherwise splendid essay of the dawn of freedom, where Du Bois still lingers over the notion of citizenship as a privilege rather than a right. And the white South proposed full voting rights rather than an honest restricted suffrage, says he. Every sensible man, black and white, would easily have chosen the latter. What I have called his high Tory understanding of civil rights powerfully animated Du Bois's exceptional early scholarship. The German social science he mastered at the University of Berlin, and the reformist zeal out of Harvard and Hull House that swept across America and swept up Du Bois in Philadelphia, convinced him that knowledge had the power to accelerate fundamental social change. As he confidently explained in 1897 to the American Academy of Political and Social Science, the world was thinking wrong about race because it did not know. The ultimate evil was stupidity. The cure for it was knowledge based on scientific investigation. It was as simple as that. The cure for it was knowledge based on scientific investigation. Thus, he persisted in believing that the annual publication of the findings of the remarkable Atlanta University studies would ameliorate Southern race relations. To be sure, Du Bois was never so naive as to suppose that racial discrimination could be abolished solely through cutting-edge scholarship, but he remained convinced for a considerable time that a revolution in race relations could be accomplished by education, individual group character, intellectual remonstrance, and presumptively unique American values of decency and equality of opportunity. The progress of the nation toward the settlement of the Negro is patent, Du Bois had predicted in the essay, The Present Outlook for Dark Races of Mankind, published more than 100 years ago. The movement, with all its retrogression, is a spiral, not a circle. And as long as there is motion, there is hope. Small wonder, then, that not a few American students of 20th century social change have recapitulated the judgment of Henry F. May's The End of Innocence, in which Du Bois is caricatured as a hieratic figure of Victorian progress and high culture. Yet, it took less than a decade for Du Bois to reach the conclusion that the motion of the racial spiral was uniquely downward. The silence of the large white philanthropies, the enmity of the Tuskegee machine, the trauma of a particularly heinous lynching in Atlanta, and Theodore Roosevelt's cynical manipulation of the Brownsville incident in which Medal of Honor black soldiers were judicially crucified, disabused him by degrees of the social science panacea. It took me but a few years in Atlanta to bring me hot and indignant to defense, he spluttered in dark water voices from the veil, a book of luminous contemplation and unforgettable snarls. In turning away from social science scholarship to race, work, activism, and militant propaganda in 1910, Du Bois's new commitment was symptomatic with the sea change in collective mentality, the collective mentality of educated Americans of African descent in his time. As a salient case in point, Thomas J. Calloway, Du Bois's Fisk University classmate and then assistant to the Librarian of Congress, wrote to some 100 race leaders inviting support for a Negro exhibit at the 1900 Universal Exposition at Paris. Applauding the Calloway Initiative, the high-toned newspaper, The Colored American, emotionally enthused on Thanksgiving Day 1900, the signs of the times are hopeful in every way for all our citizens regardless of race. Calloway's letter perfectly exemplified the citizenship ideals of its recipients, men and women who thought of themselves as Americans first, who merely happened to be dark-skinned. Yet, the progressive era was deeply inhospitable to men and women like Du Bois, many of whom were, like Du Bois, with his New England temperament and professional credentials, some of the finest exemplars of the ethos of progressivism, as the perceptive August Meyer first reminded historians. White progressives increasingly espoused a genteel nativism racism in the North, and in reaction to the flood of unfamiliar European immigrants, an ever greater sympathy for the white South's race problem. In the 20-odd years between the appearance of the Souls of Black Folk and the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act virtually closing Ellis Island, the ethnological shape of the new America evolved rapidly and congealed in the decade thereafter into an adamantine permanence that is only now beginning to show signs of dissolving. As the South's one-drop rule was adopted nationally and the category of mulatto disappeared from the U.S. Census, immigrant Americans became whiter and Negro Americans became blacker. The incoming ethnics, most but not all, took the hint that citizenship was raced and that their position in the national food chain depended on their ability to define themselves in opposition to the nation's third oldest population group. Matthew Jacobson's Whiteness of a Different Color reminds us that entire races vanished as the scheme of bifurcation espoused by Protestant affluence, increasingly supported by the craft unions, revised the national credo to read E pluribus duo. This is the ontological context in which Du Bois's afflicted interrogation in Souls should be read as a defining moment in which the new group identity for the colored educated emerges. Finding their constitutional protections effectively nullified in the South, where their livelihoods and very lives were subject to nullification, residentially segregated and occupationally marginalized in the North, these dark-skinned semi-citizens discovered and determinedly embraced their blackness as never before. Identity soon trumped nationality. Souls would have been recognized as a work of unique significance, even if by some uncharacteristic caution of the last minute it had been kept in the drawer, locked away. Of Mr. Booker T. Washington and others made Souls a contemporary bombshell. It indicted the most powerful black man in the nation and introduced the mainstream public to a small band of highly accomplished, mostly northern men and women of color, a talented tenth to whom Washington's dictatorship over educational policy and professional preferment and stance on racial segregation were anathema. Men and women unalterably convinced, said Du Bois, that the way for a people to gain their reasonable rights is not by voluntarily throwing them away and insisting that they do not want them. Du Bois saw what was fundamental then, as now, to every bargain between contending parties, the power ultimately to make the parties to the bargain keep it. The power of the ballot we need in sheer self-defense. What else will save us from a second slavery, he proclaimed. There were, of course, many sources for Du Bois's evolving perspective on race and human rights. Among the most compelling, certainly, was his precocious intellectual investment in the continent of Africa. All told, of the 17 nonfiction books authored by Du Bois, 6 were about Africa. 3 of them, the 1939 Black Folk Then and Now, the 1945 Color and Democracy, and the 1947 World and Africa, may still be read with profit. His essay, The African Roots of the War, appearing in May 1915 issue of Atlantic Monthly, was one of the analytical triumphs of the early 20th century. Du Bois poured into its maturing ideas about capitalism, class, and race, anticipating by 2 years Lenin's lodestar monograph, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Passing in kaleidoscopic review the history of the African continent from the European Renaissance to its partition at the Berlin Conference, the African roots of the war enumerated the flashpoints in the scramble for Africa that already had just missed igniting an earlier European war. It had missed earlier doing so. France and England at Fashoda, Italy at Adua, Italy and Turkey in Tripoli, England and Portugal at Delagoa Bay, England, Germany and the Dutch in South Africa, France and Spain and Morocco, Germany and France in Agadir, and the world at Algeciras. Du Bois's deepening understanding of the racial experience enabled him to historicize European racialisms of his day. You may recall that in The Souls of White Folk, his stunning essay in Dark Water, Voices from Within the Veil, Du Bois wrote that the discovery of personal whiteness among the world's people is a very modern thing, a 19th and 20th century matter indeed. And he added, today we have changed all that, and the world is of a sudden emotional conversion has discovered that it is white, and that by that token, wonderful. Du Bois's prescription to it was Pan-Africanism, a global movement to political objectives of people of color. With that visionary passion for justice nurtured by his New England upbringing and present in every book from the suppression of the Atlantic slave trade onward, Du Bois rose above the particularisms to deliver the same resolution to Arkansas pogroms, organized labor's color bar, and the white voting primaries, as to South African land acts and systematic brutality of Belgian cartels in the Congo. Quote, the absolute equality of races, physical, political, and social, is the founding stone of world peace and human advancement. Although Du Bois postulated race, though, as one of the building blocks of the social universe, over time, he did come to emphasize the gospel of wealth in his own country as well as beyond as the fundamental impediment to the expansion of human rights. In his magisterial 1935 book, as we've heard, Black Reconstruction in America, he would call the widespread conviction that the unregulated market economy determined best the social application of the nation's fabulous material resources. He would call that, quote, the great American assumption. Perry Miller and Sakhvan Berkovich, and as I was reminded last evening at dinner, Joseph Stalin would later capture its ethos. Yet as far as I can determine, the creed of American exceptionalism attained its formulaic status among historians after Du Bois described its essence as the great American assumption in Black Reconstruction. The exceptionalist creed holds that progress in all its dimensions is linear and infinite in the United States, and that the power of individuals to shape their destinies has been and remains unparalleled in human experience in Africa, in America, that when people fall, the fault is theirs, not society's. But what was exceptionally true for some Americans was much less true for many others, and for some time it was not true at all. And it befell critics such as Du Bois to speak for the marginalized and excluded by bringing to the agora of American concerns messages of distress, of increasing alarm, and ultimate condign reproach. A searing passage in the souls of black folk exclaims, therefore, to be a poor man in a land of dollars is hard. To be a poor race is the very bottom of hardship. But had black people been doomed to become a mudsill in the modern republic? Du Bois's Black Reconstruction in America's greatest achievement was to weave a credible historical narrative in which the slaves, suddenly admitted to the citizenship in an environment of feral hostility, displayed admirable volition and intelligence. His great book invested the freed people with what a later generation of historians would gravely call agency. Du Bois returns them to the center of a Reconstruction epic as they steal away to freedom, a great many clueless in the early days, but quickly setting their minds to getting a plot of land, some little book learning, and soon enough voting their own kind into office. The treatment of these first days of manumission summons the author's awesome gift of lyricism to full throttle in The Coming of the Lord, a chapter drawn in mesmeric purple. A great human sob shrieked in the wind and tossed its tears upon the sea. Free, free, free. Volition, intelligence, and agency Du Bois applied in bountiful, and some critics would insist in overripe and excessive portions to Afro-Americans in the Reconstruction drama. But it was in his interpretation of the generative function of black labor in the formation of industrial wealth that Du Bois posited the first of several original conceptions of profound impact. Writing in The Black Worker, the book's opening chapter of Black Reconstruction, that black labor, quote, became the foundation stone not only of the Southern social structure, but of Northern manufacture and commerce, of the English factory system, of European commerce, of buying and selling on a worldwide scale. Du Bois cast the slave from Africa as the fulcrum of the Industrial Revolution. In consequence of its defeat of Spain, Georgian England became the 18th century's chief supplier of human flesh at 20 pounds a head times 10 million. according to Du Bois, that 18th century profits from the Atlantic slave trade that financed the iron production and textile manufacture of the British and French maritime bourgeoisie was a proposition that must have come as a matter of logic to the author of The Suppression of the Atlantic Slave Trade, now steeped in Marx. Invited back to the NAACP in 1944 as director of special research after his forceful retirement from Atlanta University, Du Bois strove to commit the association to a program of asserted internationalism and domestically to one of economic democracy. If timing in history is almost everything, then Du Bois perceived the immediate World War II aftermath as a unique opportunity like that of 1896 for the forces of progress. His widely reviewed new book, Color and Democracy, appearing 2 weeks after the surrender of Nazi Germany, made patent the integral connection between domestic civil rights and global advance of social democracy. Never in world history has democracy had such an opportunity to lead civilization as here and now, he professed in the summer of 1946 issue of the Christian Register. But this means universal education and health care, and it means sufficient work and income to secure and protect these rights and privileges. Over the hardening displeasure of the NAACP officials, Roy Wilkins and Thurgood Marshall, Du Bois presided over the 1945 Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England, and attempted to embed the NAACP in the anti-colonial politics of new African leaders. As historians Penny Van Eschen, Gail Plummer, Theodore Bostelman, and most recently Kenneth Jankin and Carol Anderson have shown, this progressive civil rights agenda wilted in the heat of anti-communist passions and the realpolitik of the emergent national security state. Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri in March of 1946 enraged Du Bois, who denounced it in the Chicago Defender as one of the most discouraging occurrences of modern times. With rare exceptions, other race leaders adjusted rather quickly to the changing circumstances, jettisoning the petition and appeal to the world, one of Du Bois's appeals. They made the implementation of the historic 1947 Truman Civil Rights Committee report to secure these rights their top priority. But Du Bois characteristically looked upon the ultimate value of citizenship for Africans in America with the greatest misgivings if that citizenship were to mean that the peoples of Africa and Asia were to become subjects under a Pax Americana maintained for the profit of the military-industrial complex. It is fair to admit, Du Bois wrote in The World in Africa in 1947, in his book summing up the essence of Cold War civil rights, that most American Negroes, even those of intelligence and courage, do not yet fully realize that they are being bribed to trade equal status in the United States for the slavery of the majority of men. To NAACP board member Eleanor Roosevelt, such sentiments were appalling, and she made her displeasure powerfully clear to the directors of the association. She was only narrowly dissuaded from resigning from the board, but after Du Bois publicly championed Henry Wallace's presidential campaign, the NAACP fired him in September 1948. Suddenly, the world changed, but Du Bois stubbornly did not. In the aftermath of this Truman landslide victory of 1948 and the wreckage of the Progressive Party, parameters of patriotism narrowed to exclude the internationalism and economic democracy of the recent past. A sharp New York Times exchange with Secretary of State Dean Acheson over Du Bois's sponsorship of the Stockholm Peace Petition put him between the crosshairs of the new national security state. Du Bois knew what price he would pay for his opposition to the Cold War, and his hard-hitting 1952 memoir, In Battle for Peace, deplored the faint-heartedness of African-American public figures and the absurdity of his Justice Department indictment and Smith Act trial in Washington in 1951. That trial resulted in one of the rare acquittals of the McCarthy period. But the unexpected acquittal not only precluded Albert Einstein's appearance as a character witness, it also deprived American political letters of the courtroom speech in which Du Bois would have unforgettably obscured cold warriors. Consigned to the American equivalent of the Russian Gulag, an unperson deprived of passport, he was comforted and assisted by his new wife, the author and musicologist Shirley Graham, and new friends on the left. Du Bois continued speaking, writing, scolding, and infuriating from his book-lined study at 30 Grace Court in Brooklyn and from his third-floor Manhattan office in 23rd Street. He continued to decry the architects of Henry Lewis's American century. "These interests want war," he thundered in the National Guardian. "Only by war can China, Africa, and Southeast Asia and the Middle East be kept in their control." The axiom that Du Bois embraced was, he proclaimed, that just as Africans in the United States, under the corporate rule of monopolized wealth, will be confined to the lowest wage group, so the peoples of the developing world faced subordination in the global scheme of things capitalist. As a battle to the death had been joined between the two superpowers, he saw himself being compelled by the logic of his racial and economic priorities to espouse the cause of opponents of Wall Street and the Pentagon, even when such advocacy corrupted other ideals of intellectual honesty, really, and humanism. His passport restored in 1958, he flew off the next year to red carpet receptions in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, and China, adding to honorary doctorates from ancient universities the award by the Soviet Union of the Lenin Peace Prize. Mao's China celebrated his birthday as a national holiday on the occasion of his visit in 1959. On October 1, 1961, Du Bois applied for membership in the Communist Party and departed immediately for self-exile in Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana at 93, and just as lunch counter sit-ins and freedom bus rides foreshadowed the beginning of the end of the racial segregation in America, Du Bois had spent his life fighting. He denounced the Supreme Court's 1955 oxymoron, all deliberate speed. He had inveighed against the Eisenhower administration's feckless response to the White South's intransigence, and finally had concluded that Martin Luther King Jr.'s otherwise admirable nonviolent passive resistance was doomed to failure because it was devoid of an economic agenda. Du Bois's visionary conceit, some would say, carried him past the desegregation of public schools and lunch counters to a starring role in a better world trying to be born outside the folds of rapacious capitalism. In one of his last Jeremiads, before exiling himself to Ghana, Du Bois called for the restoration of democracy in America. "Make it again possible for the people to express their will," he implored. "Today, the rich and the powerful rulers of America divide themselves into Republican and Democrats in order to raise millions of dollars to buy the next election to prevent you from having a third party to vote for or to stop war, theft, and murder by your votes." 2 decades into the 21st century, the question imposes as to the lasting saliency of the body of the bold, encompassing Du Boisian scholarship, protest, and prophecy. In the main, Du Bois's prediction about the centennial paramount save race was to be sadly fulfilled in the fastening on of white supremacy in Asia, Africa, and the United States by the first decade of the 1900s. Consequently, the last third of the 20th century was one of great social and political challenges and the repair of racial injustices and the satisfaction of color-coded aspirations in the aftermath of overthrown European empires and dismantled apartheid regimes. That much of the progress in domestic and international human rights was his due, Du Bois duly self-acknowledged in one of the most remarkable paragraphs in American autobiographical letters. Writing in the 1940 memoir, Dusk of Dawn, with its grandiose subtitle, An Essay Toward the Autobiography of a Race Concept, he said that his life should be understood as a mighty paradigm. I think I might say, without boasting, that in the period from 1910 to 1930, I was the main factor in revolutionizing the attitude of the American Negro toward caste, he modestly allowed. A new edition of The Souls of Black Folk is forthcoming this month, properly so, because that book is both timeless while being also time-bound. Like the public's immutable memory of Martin Luther King's dream speech, so the vivid retention of Du Bois's color line prophecy has meant that the evolved ideas both men held in their last years are forgotten, unknown, deemed subversive, or all of the above. We should probably not expect to see the release of the new edition of In Battle for Peace, Du Bois's account of his 1952 Justice Department indictment trial and embarrassed acquittal. In a 1951 op-ed in the National Guardian, he called for a vast social change and warned that America's democratic ideals were salvageable only by drastically curbing the present power of concentrated wealth. To be sure, the complexities of the American 21st century do beggar those of the last. Du Bois's 20th century problem was a color line, actually without color, for it was starkly black and white. Our century is on its way to being brown and yellow, as well as minority white and black. Still, as Du Bois might well have argued, to concede that a historic racial dyad has yielded to a polychrome present does not mean that race has been transcended as a potent force in our national life. Rather, as Du Bois himself predicted in his final years, the future problems of the color line will be problems of the cash and credit line, in which problems of the past will play a truly significant part. In one of his last jeremiads before exiling himself to Ghana, he called for a restoration of democracy in America. Martin Luther King Jr. famously told a capacity Carnegie Hall audience on the centenary of Du Bois's birth that it was never possible to know where the scholar Du Bois ended and the organizer Du Bois began. The two qualities in him were, said King, a single unified force. History cannot ignore Dr. Du Bois, King insisted. Yet when King spoke these words 5 years after Du Bois died in Accra, Du Bois had been virtually excised from his country's mainstream narrative as an expatriate and a communist. Said King, our irrational, obsessive anti-communism has led us into too many quagmires to be retained as if it were a mode of scientific thinking. Dr. King went on to say, and he reminded his audiences that Abraham Lincoln had warmly welcomed the support of Karl Marx during the Civil War and corresponded with him freely. The old contrarian's death had come as Dr. King prepared to deliver his dream speech from the Lincoln Memorial Steps in 1963. Thus, the generational baton had passed that day with stunning symbolic appropriateness. 6 weeks after his 1968 Carnegie Hall centenary tribute to Du Bois, Martin Luther King died of a sniper's bullet. Were he with us this afternoon, the old contrarian Du Bois would almost surely discern in the shortcomings of the last U.S. presidential administration the toxic persistence of race. Senatorial candidate Obama debuted at the 2004 Democratic Convention, where he struck a memorable exceptionalist chord by assuring us that there is not a black America and a white America and a Latino America and an Asian America. There is the United States of America. Presidential Obama, candidate Obama, channeled the e pluribus unum mythos of American exceptionalism as seldom before by a credible public figure. Not only did he minimize the significance of political labels, but racism was seen as an old problem that the candidate's generation, he called it the Joshua generation, could refute and even move beyond, as it honored Rosa, Whitney, John Lewis, and Martin of the Moses generation in The Audacity of Hope, his ambitious campaign book. Indeed, in his Dreams from My Father, the most revelatory personal narrative written by a major political figure, the 44th president tells us that he was put off by the anguished writings of Du Bois, Langston Hughes, Richard Wright, and Ralph Ellison, each man finally forced to withdraw, one to Africa, one to Europe, one deeper into the bowels of Harlem, Obama sighed. All of them exhausted, bitter men, the devil at their heels. To be sure, the legacy of Barack Obama is writing itself as we speak. Yet what can be sadly realized is that a redeeming vision of a national post-reset, racial reset, that defined the Obama presidency has succumbed to the nightmare of worsening disparities, now almost irrevocably color-coded by Supreme Court majorities disingenuously mocking African American and Latino voting rights, by reborn nativism more virulent than its mid-19th century parent, and by a criminal justice system irregularities such as the Zimmerman acquittal, the Ferguson impasse, perceived as outrageous enough to spark corrective riots. The first existential president appeared to believe that he could resolve these insurmountable dilemmas of nationality and color, unforgettably posed by Du Bois's foundational text, notwithstanding the reality of white majority votes against him in 2008 and 2016. The vital center did not hold, and the angry fringe prevailed 2 Novembers ago, delivering a confused democracy to a kleptocratic oligarchy presided over by a narcissistic aberration. When he left this pleasant village in the mountains of western Massachusetts, Du Bois made the existential decision that his life would exemplify the American race problem, that Du Bois saw his illustrious civil rights vocation in such existential terms was summed up shortly before his death in 1963, when he reiterated in his third autobiography that but for the race problem, he might have become, he said, an unquestioning worshiper of at the shrine of the established social order into which I was born. But just that part of this order which seemed to me, and seemed to most of my fellows, nearest perfection, seemed to me to be most inequitable and wrong. And so, starting from that critique, I gradually, as the years went by, found other things to question. In contrast to the profile of most lives, Du Bois, at 95, was more radically unorthodox than virtually any other engaged intellectual, black or white, of the 20th century. The problem of the age, as Du Bois ultimately realized, was not color, but unregulated capital, the exploitation of the great majority of humankind by the kleptocratic minority. Indeed, in his preface to the 50th anniversary edition of Souls, Du Bois leaves his final word on the subject. I still think today that the color line is a great problem of this century. But today, I see more clearly than yesterday that back of the problem of race and color lies a greater problem which both obscures and implements it. And that is the fact that so many civilized persons are willing to live in comfort even if the price of this is poverty, ignorance, and disease of the majority of their fellow men. That to maintain this privilege, men have waged war until today war tends to become universal and continuous, and the excuse for this war continues largely to be color and race. To Du Bois, the real problem of the century, therefore, was really the manipulation of race in the service of wealth. And a clairvoyant Du Bois greatly feared that the odds increasingly favored the manipulations by the rich. 150 years late, as the inspiring month-long February embrace by the citizens of his hometown, Great Barrington, and the formal resolution by the Massachusetts State Legislature attest when they voted that Du Bois was one of the great native sons of their state. The time has now arrived both to comprehend the flaws of William Burghardt Du Bois and to prize his genius. Thank you for bearing with me.